Danny, how does what Sontag is writing about and speaking to about the way all art aspires to be photography? And I found another one of her quotes, which was, "To photograph is to appropriate the thing photographed," which I thought was similarly powerful. Um, how does that mediate your relationship with using photography at the heart of your work?
Yeah, let me just touch on that first question you had about um, everything becoming, or art becoming, everything becoming a photograph.
Yeah.
To be honest, still working my way through that one. Um,
Right.
questions in an artist's life, I promise you, are unresolved and works in progress. And there was that sort of great quote that you had, and also the question. Well, what I found with photography, in the sense that yes, it is a capture.
Mm,
Sontag also makes a really quite close analogy with hunting and safari hunting,
right.
and how guns and weapons were sort of swapped out for highly technical cameras.
Yeah.
So you would still be hunting, and the vernacular language of photography is the same as hunting, where you're shooting
Yes.
and taking a picture and capturing something. And so there's this whole sort of dynamic thing of searching and looking and finding and discovering. And some of those early photographers um, would kind of use that same analogy when, sort of, if you like walking the streets of Paris, in those early days, capturing and
Yeah.
hunting. And there's these sorts of wonderful analogies that come up in terms of the way we can talk about it now, particularly with that flood of Instagram images, with flood of digital images everywhere. There's just saturation. Even Sontag was making the point in the early 70s about there being a flood and a
Yeah.
saturation of imagery.
He had no idea what 50 years later looks like, where our
No,
whole life is like, here's my Instagram feed, and this is my life.
it's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that was quite sort of, it was very soothsayerish almost to
Yeah.
be writing that at the time when there was an explosion of, if you like, analog photography.
Yeah.
But and you and I would be familiar with that, where you either sent off, in the early days, rolls of film, or you
Right.
went to the 1 hour photo kiosk, and you'd come back. Usually it wasn't 1 hour, you come back in 90 minutes, sort of thing.
Yeah.
But it was always, yeah, come back then. But so yeah, but there's this whole sort of transformation, and to be part of that, to be growing up in the 70s as in a very analog sort of way, and to have gone through those 4 decades, 5 decades of transformation, it's been absolutely remarkable.
Yeah.
So in terms of my work,
Yeah.
I have always been really fascinated with photography and for its power. And I think that relates to the image. I've always seen older photographs that relied on capturing light very directly with chemicals and those sorts of things to be almost time traveling objects.
Right.
And I love thinking, opposing the thinking around light being captured by a chemical on paper and then traveling through time. So you're looking at, it's a very poetic analogy, it probably breaks down somewhere, but you're looking at light that has been captured and comes to you from the past.
Right.
And so for me, the archive has always held a kind of a specialness.
Mm.
And in some ways that relates to my own experience as a child growing up, seeing archival pictures of our family. And we have pictures of my Aboriginal grandmas that go back to 1908. So my great-great-grandmother was, I guess you would say, an avid carte visitor. So she would have portraits done
Right.
in the studio. And so we have this as a kind of an image memory, but it was made real by the fact that, my great-grandmother was alive into my teenage years. So there was a living connection, a connection through these beautiful photographs. So I think if my great-great-grandmother, who sort of got these portraits done, had been alive today, she would be sort of an Instagram star. She was very much into taking a selfie star or something. I mean, she was quite, a beautiful woman, and
Yeah.
so the portraits that we have are really wonderfully sort of evocative, and to look back and to think about their lives is really poignant. So I think in some ways the power around the imagery is preserved because there aren't that many.
Yeah.
I mean, there's quite a lot considering that they came from that time, or quite a number rather. But in the sense that it's not a flood, and so there's impact and power. And I think that's the same for a lot of family photographs that come from that particular era. There's a real sense of looking back, and there's a certain emotional tug. There's like a poignancy about the act of looking. And Sontag writes about that, actually. The photograph, she points out very importantly, is a way of almost stopping the march of mortality or the march of life. It freezes life and stops, if you like, that sense of death or dying. So the photograph is very emblematic in that sense. So looking back, we kind of see life in a way sustained through an image. And it's a very strange sort of experience because we are spectating.
Right.
And we are sort of almost, in a way, looking at someone, particularly with older photographs, who has passed away. And so I approach those sorts of images with absolute reverence because they're people who live, they're people who experience things. We share, in some ways, the emotion and the things that they went through, in very different forms. And, in the case of First Nations women, Aboriginal women, less brutally so, because, I mean, that time of transformation would have been, I find it difficult to even think about how much turmoil and how people were actually kept things together as they did, because, effectively, literally, their whole life was changed and land and country was taken away.
Yeah.
And so that sense of tens of thousands of years of connection within 2 or 3 generations is disrupted, often violently.
Yes.
And so the photographs themselves tell a very poignant and very powerful sort of story. Yeah.
Hey, it's MBS here. Look, if you picked up my new book, How to Begin, Start Doing Something That Matters, and you're like, I like this, or even if you haven't yet picked it up, you should go check out howtobegin.com. There's a bunch of additional resources, videos, templates that you can download to really help you get started on the stuff that matters.